Welcome to episode 143 of Business Growth School for Service Providers. I'm your host Ali Salman, and this podcast is brought to you by Rapid Boost Marketing, online marketing for service providers. Today we are talking about how to build an authority as a service provider through podcasting. Yesterday we talked about 7 business growth strategies part 4, and all the links are in the show notes at rapidboostmarketing.com/grow. We know that an industry group estimates over 50% of the new cars sold by next year will have internet connectivity, and by 2025 each and every car sold in the world will have internet connectivity. So that tells us about something that the podcast will be accessible to anyone who will be driving their car. It's not just radio. Secondly, we have seen the growth of podcasting from 2006 when it got basically launched, right? And consistently it's growing every year. That means that more and more people are listening to the podcast. Third thing which I really like about it as a service provider, podcasting can be an impressive way for you to build an authority in a local market. I mean, if you're an immigration lawyer, you can build a podcast around immigration law. You're a landscaping company, you can have a podcast around landscaping. There's a lot of ideas for service providers where they can build authority through podcast. The beauty is that the podcast as a medium is not being utilized or overused by a lot of people. So if I pick up your city, and let's say if you're a plumber, I mean, I highly doubted that any other plumbing company is actually doing a podcast. So very few service providers are actually taking advantage of this traffic channel. So make sure you basically take advantage of it. And one of the best things about this channel is that the tip we do is we have a daily podcast, and we bash the content. We record it once a week, and basically make sure that every day our listeners like you get fresh content. Now, what does that mean? That means that the production cost and time for a service provider is less than a video or a blog post. So you can actually create a lot of podcast content fast. So let me walk you through a simple strategy on how to basically start your own first podcast, right? And in the show notes, I've also included a checklist which you can go over in order to make sure that you're getting everything right for your podcast launch. Number one is basically step by step, decide on the length of your podcast, like how long you're gonna have the podcast: 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. Who's your audience? Who will be listening to this podcast? Number two, decide on the frequency of the podcast episode. What does that mean? Are you going once a week? Are you going daily? Are you going once every bi-weekly? Are you going once a quarter? How often are you going? Decide the theme of your podcast and break down that theme into manageable topics. Decide on the production efforts like a music and some other effects which you want to add. Once you've decided on these four things, then what you can do is using the brain dump technique to get all your ideas and topics out on a paper. Okay. Then what you will do, you will organize these topics and ideas into logical order in order to give your podcast a proper flow. Okay. Once you have done that, then you set up and familiarize yourself with all your hardware. I mean, make sure your audio quality is top notch, right? Okay. Then what you will do is you will use your outline to prevent yourself from getting lost. So basically, you remember that we talked about a flow. So make sure you're following a podcast flow. Then you also keep an eye on the clock to make sure that if you decided to have a podcast for 10 minutes, you're recording it for 10 minutes. And as I said, repeat the practice, right? Try to record a trial episode. And make mistakes in it, right? So when you're recording your first episode, you have an idea, you have gotten some practice too. then what you have to do is you have to remember that you are a performer. You have to entertain, you have to engage your audience. You have to make sure the delivery style suits your personality and material. And all these steps I have mentioned in the show notes at rapidboostmarketing.com/grow, so you guys can go and take a look at it. And most importantly, relax and breathe naturally. Very, very important. Last part of a podcast is once you have produced an episode, once you have put it together, then what you can do is you can basically put it through iTunes and Google Music, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and those are all aggregator platform which will help you get the distribution of your podcast. So in tomorrow's episode, in episode 144, we'll basically talk about how to market your podcast. Today we talk about that how you can start a podcast as a service provider, and in the show notes you also have a checklist which you guys can use. And tomorrow I will be touching based on how you can market the podcast, right? And tricks and strategies used by world biggest podcast on how they are promoting the podcast and getting millions of listeners to listen to it. I'll catch you tomorrow bright and early in episode 144 of Business Growth School for Service Providers. I'm your host Ali Salman, and this podcast is brought to you by Rapid Boost Marketing, online marketing for local service providers. Have a good day, make it count. Bye bye.